Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Innovate or die. Sorry I'm being a bit dramatic, but it's actually true. We live very much in a world of change, but the change is not so much in technology. The change is in the world around us. Societal changes, the evolution of the way that we live, they're the ones that actually drive the technology changes. Technology is not causing the change. Technology is basically responding to the changes and allowing us to do new things. So these external forces are things that we cannot control. You know, we are, all of us, getting older. I'm going to be talking for about 30 minutes. And in that 30 minutes, all of you in this room, life expectancy will have gone up by about 5 minutes. Now, that's the effect my presentations have. But no, it's actually to do with health. We are living longer by an astonishing amount, about 2 months every year in Western nations. And that's a cause for great excitement for myself. It's a cause of great concern if you happen to be in the pensions business or in providing social services and so on. We are moving towards a world of urbanisation. You know, for centuries, millennia, most of the people have lived on the land in rural environments. We've now passed the 50% point where at least more than 50% of people live in cities, in urban environments, and that is going up. We're seeing more and more big cities. That changes the demand for services. We're seeing an inevitable drift of economic power, if you like, down from the north and the Western Hemisphere towards the south and the east. And that will change things. And we're all getting richer. The climb out of poverty, you know, we're seeing these emerging nations now, an emerging middle class, getting more money, getting better jobs, and aspiring to the sorts of things that we have. And therefore, that is driving a global economy, even though you might not know it at this point in time. And that gives rise to a set of economic changes, of technology changes. I talk about ambient computing, everything in the cloud. I mean, the decision over cloud is now no longer if, but when. And we're losing our fixation about specific devices. Devices are getting smarter. We're seeing more and more of them, tens and tens of billions of devices, such that in the future, most of the transactions that take place will not be between people and machines, but between machines and machines. The smart devices, the robots, will be working on our behalf. And you know, many of you in this room may be wearing a fitness monitor, a Fitbit or whatever. And it is a real truism that, you know, if you're not paying for a product, then you are the product. And we're giving away our information to a whole range of suppliers in return for a whole range of possible services. And that leaves rise to this massive increase in information and the analytics industry that goes with it. You know, we know everything. The world is full of information, and the smart organizations take advantage of that. It's now getting to the point where the information about a product is becoming more important than the product itself. And that's something we'll talk about in a little bit. And then, of course, there's cybersecurity. You know, we all worry a lot about cybersecurity, but there's nothing much we can do about it other than protect ourselves as best we can. We are generally our own worst enemies. You know, the ethical use of data is becoming a key discriminator, a key differentiator between those organizations that will succeed and those organizations that fail. Beware the law of unintended consequences. Just because you can use the information doesn't necessarily mean you should, that it's the right thing to do. And you know, those ethical decisions are very tough to make. They're not the things that CIOs and IT leaders have really gotten used to. They're not the things that business leaders are particularly good at either. But they are things that we're going to have to face. So, what do we do? Well, the simple answer is doing nothing is not an option. 50 years ago, the average age of a company on the Standard & Poor's index was over 60 years. That was where you found the big established companies. They'd been going for a long time. They expected to go for a lot longer. The average age now is less than 15 years. And by 2020, half, or more than 3/4 in fact, of the companies will be ones we've never heard of. The big companies are dying. And they're dying because they're unable to change as quickly as they need to. As we said, small companies can use the technology more efficiently and become serious competitors. John Chambers, not saying anything new to be honest, but more than 1/3 of businesses today will not survive the next 10 years. At the beginning of the 1990s, there were more than 100 companies actually involved in the mini computer industry, making mini computers. And these were big companies, they were successful companies. By the end of that decade, there were just two. Just two. All the rest had disappeared because they failed to adapt to the changing technology architectures, towards networks, towards microcomputers and PCs and so on. And the same is happening in industry after industry. Organizations miss market transitions because they're living in them. And they also tend to focus on their competitors today. The biggest competitive threat to every large organization is not all the other large organizations that their marketing people follow on a day-by-day basis. They're all doing the same things that you are. The biggest threat is the small company you have never heard of. They're below your radar screen, but they're growing so fast that by the time you actually recognize them as a threat, you are already dead. You just don't know it. The rate of change, the rate of advancement of small companies is positively scary. So one has to ask the question, why is it that large organizations find it absolutely so difficult to innovate? Well, I'm not normally known for being soft on large organizations and having a lot of sympathy for them, but in fairness, most large organizations are pretty good at what they do. And therefore the bar is set very high. Getting better when you're good is very, very difficult. It's not easy. Equally, though, there are too many vested interests. People like the status quo. The whole hierarchy of large organizations is based on a military top-down model of command and control. It's about instantiating and maintaining the power base, the status quo. People don't like change. If you're at the top, do you want to give that up? Probably not. Change is very difficult. Most organizations change best when they're facing a real crisis. Think about Nokia, think about the burning platforms memos and so on that we see from large organizations. When you're facing death, then you will do anything to actually survive. But by then, it's usually too late. Change represents a threat. Change is not good. Change is not what companies want. Every CIO, or every CEO rather, will stand up at the annual shareholders meeting and say, we're going to innovate. We're spending all of this money on research and development and innovation. Why? Because the board of directors expects him to and the shareholders expect him to. But shareholders don't like change. Shareholders want a return on their investment. Because if they're not getting a return on their investment, they're going to put their money somewhere else. They want stability. They want growth. But there's this sort of myth that somehow innovation is going to be good. Well, yes, innovation is necessary because of the rising tide of small companies below. But you're caught between a rock and a hard place when you're a large organization, in that you know you need to innovate, and yet the people that you are responsible to don't actually want innovation, even though they talk the talk. Because innovation represents a threat to stability, a threat to profits, a threat to revenues. And finally, probably the biggest one, it's a cultural thing. Large organizations have developed this success culture. We are good. We expect ourselves to be good. We expect our people to be good. We expect projects to be good. You can't succeed all the time. Companies don't like failure. What happens if you fail? Often you get fired. So people don't even try. You don't want to do something that's not going to work. So this success culture really works against large organizations. It encourages the status quo. And the status quo is exactly what you don't want. But then, of course, there's this myth, a huge myth, a lot of myths actually, about innovation in small companies. There's this idea that small companies are very good at innovation. No, they're not. Small companies don't innovate. They don't have legacy. They don't have to change. It's easy when you're not having to change something. They're just doing it. Their structure is fluid. You think about small companies. How many org charts do you see? Not very many. They all pile in together. They've got this innate belief that they can do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have started. They know they're going to succeed. However outrageous it is, they're absolutely optimistic about it. And there's no norm. There's no status quo. They're starting from nothing and they're aiming for the sky. And they're prepared to break the rules. You think about some of the startups that have been the most disruptive recently. Companies like Uber and companies like Airbnb. They break the rules and look what happens. You know, you can't get a taxi in Paris because the taxi drivers have actually blocked all the streets because they're worried about Uber taking their jobs away. Because Uber doesn't follow the rules. Airbnb doesn't make people pay accommodation taxes to the city. And yet they compete against hotels. They break the rules all the time, and they don't care because they actually believe in doing something differently. They want to change the status quo. And when all else fails, they simply pivot. You know, they don't actually worry too much. They'll just change the strategy completely. Okay, that didn't work. Now we'll try something else. And it's much easier if you don't have to worry about continuing with all the customers you've got. If you don't have many customers, then in fact we'll just find some others doing something else. And it's a different attitude. So small companies find it easier to grow because they'll grow into a space. Large companies are trying to protect what they've got and often unable to move because of that. The small companies bring on new business models. I talked about Uber and Airbnb. They've developed a model which is actually probably the most disruptive thing going in this world of digital. I call it the aggregated virtual asset model. You know, what does Uber do? Uber runs a taxi company, and yet they don't own a car. They don't own a taxi. They've taken those assets, they've virtualized them, and they've given the running cost to someone else. Now you might say, well, that's just sort of outsourcing and so on. It's unfair, yes, but it's very efficient. What they've done, actually, is they've realized that the information about where a customer is, which comes from the app and from the GPS sensing in the mobile phone, they know where the customer is, they know where the car is, they know where all those cars are, and they can put them together very quickly because they manipulate the information. They're not manipulating physical objects, they're manipulating digital objects. They've moved into a digital world where the information becomes the proxy for the physical. And it's much, much easier to mess with digital objects than it is to mess with physical objects. They rely on the availability of what we call fungible assets. And a fungible asset is a replaceable asset. An asset where you can take one thing and replace it with something else. And everyone says, well, you know, all of the things that I've got are irreplaceable. No, they are not. We've spent a lot of time over the last few months trying to actually work out which assets, and I mean an asset not in a financial sense, but an object, a capability, a skill, or whatever, inside an organization, which of those are replaceable and which are not. You know what we found? Very, very few are irreplaceable. Very few. And that's going to be a real problem for organizations. They significantly reduce the amount of capital they've employed, so this model is very, very efficient. Produces a far greater rate of return. Now, the traditional organizations will say, well, it's unfair. They're not playing by the same rules. Well, tough. They know that. They're reinventing the rules as they go along. Then we've got digital platforms and marketplaces. You know, the idea that we have fixed supply chains and so on is gone. The idea that we have fixed processes is gone. We're building reusable modular business processes, where the open APIs and the data just move seamlessly, and instead of having a one-to-one relationship, we have a one-to-many relationship. Within the next 10 years, instead of reordering something from your original supplier when you run out, your app, your automated environment, your automated agent, your robot, whatever you want to call it, is probably going to actually go out there and say, okay, I need 1,000 of these widgets. Who's going to give me a price? And when can you deliver? And then it will go out there and look at those sorts of organizations and their social standing on things like Facebook and LinkedIn and all these other ones and say, well, they're unreliable, and those are reliable, and this one is actually going to reduce the price because they're oversupplied and they want to win some business. So we now have a one-to-many. Everything will become a fluid market. Everything will become a digital market, and that creates all sorts of opportunities for new organizations to come in, small organizations that understand the digital environment, that can actually work effectively in this. And they work with the community. They don't actually try to do everything themselves, they get other people to do it for them. You know, build the community, build the platform, rely on individuals, rely on small organizations. Don't actually believe you've got to do everything yourself. And then there's, of course, this sharing economy, this idea of collaboration, cooperation. You know, it's not always about money. Large organizations are fixated by money. They actually believe everything has a price, and that price is always monetary. You know, we had a big debate inside Gartner some time back with Google going into the automotive sector. And everyone was saying, well, you know, Google shouldn't be going into the automotive sector. They don't understand the rules and so on. Well, actually, they did understand the rules. They just didn't intend playing by them. But the interesting thing is not whether Google is going to build an automated vehicle or whether it's going to be successful at it. To me, the interesting thing is going to be what Google is going to charge for that automated vehicle. And personally, I reckon it's going to work on what I describe as the Indian taxi ride principle. Now, if you've ever been to India and taken a taxi, you know, you jump into the taxi and you tell the driver where you want to go. And you're getting about halfway to your destination. He turns around to you and says, you know, my brother-in-law's got a shop just round the corner. You know, why don't we stop off there? He's got some wonderful carpets or whatever. You can't get from A to B without going via a number of his associates. And Google will be the same, I believe. Google knows where you are. It knows where you want to go. It knows where all of your customers are. Or where its customers are. Because, of course, there's this big myth. You know, we all use Google, but you're not Google's customer. You are the product. Remember what I said? If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. One of my colleagues was actually sitting opposite me at a conference recently. We were out in Mexico, and he was saying, why is Google giving me all sorts of results for whatever it was he was looking for in Mexico? I don't live in Mexico. And I had to gently remind him, that's not the point. You know, you are not Google's customer. Google is serving its customers by telling you where you can buy what you want here in Mexico. And Google therefore knows where all of its customers are, and it will direct you to them. And you know, if you're prepared to go via those customers, your ride will be free. If you want a premium service, then you're probably going to have to pay for it. You know, we can do different things. Information is more valuable to Google than money. And information is more valuable to a lot of organizations, or it should be. Don't always think about the money. And I talked about information and fungibility of assets, just to give you some ideas. You know, we used to think of a train ride. Well, now, train ride is about getting from A to B. It can just as easily be a car share. And we're seeing a whole range of those come in. You know, the local curry house, your local takeaway shop, you go to a Just Eat online app that will give you access to 100 takeaways and have it delivered to your house. There's a whole range of different things that you can do. Things like trust and reputation. You know, the mainstay of banks. They will say to you, oh, we're very trustworthy. Oh, look at our reputation. Well, sorry, for a young generation, that reputation means nothing. What matters is how many friends you've got on Facebook. And therefore, your social standing and social recommendation and reputation score is much more important. We've digitized the idea of 100 years of reputation. You don't need the knowledge anymore. You can go to a cloud-based virtual assistant and ask Siri. You might not always get the answer you expect, but that technology is improving. Production lines can make way for the local 3D printing service. You don't have to buy an entire factory anymore. You simply can get hold of a machine or use someone else's to deliver what it is you want. And, you know, taxis, delivery services, capital. You know, capital, you don't have to have capital, you can go to crowdfunding. You don't have to indebt yourself to the bank to do it. And instead of using your own experience, you can use the community's experience. Pretty much everything that you can imagine in business out there now is actually replaceable. There's plenty of them out there, and small organizations are learning how to do that very successfully. Digital effectively requires organizations not just to have a new strategy, you've got to go up from that. Strategy is just about how you actually deliver your vision. And digital requires a new vision. And it requires a new vision for all sorts of companies. Mark Fields, the CEO at Ford, you know, a very established, previously very successful organization in an industry that's been around a long time, stood up and did a keynote at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas in January of this year. And he talked about Ford's new digital mobility. Smart mobility, they call it, a blueprint for mobility. Experimentation, he's talking about. Lots and lots of innovation going on, leading to an all-new model of transportation within the next 10 years. So there's a recognition this isn't going to happen overnight. You can't change large organizations quickly, but you do have to start now. And he's realized, as have all of the other automobile vendors, that they're not in the car business anymore. Yeah, sure, they're still going to be producing vehicles, but they're equally doing other things. Why do people buy cars? Because they want to get from A to B. It's like the old joke, you know, why do people buy electric drills? What does Black & Decker or DeWalt sell? They don't sell electric drills, they sell holes. Because you don't buy an electric drill unless you want a hole. You don't buy a car unless you want to get from A to B. And Ford and Daimler have realized they're in that business. They're in the business of actually providing mobility and transportation. But the most interesting thing that he said on that keynote was this statement about innovation. He said, will we crack the code on our first try? Probably not. That's okay, that's part of innovation. Now, it isn't often that you get the CEO of a major global organization effectively saying, we are going to fail. And that's okay. Because we have to try all these things. Some of them will work, some of them will not. Failure is okay. And that's directly contradictory to this sort of success culture that we've built up. We have to learn how to fail and move on very quickly. Failure is as good as anything else. So, 3 rules for success. Try and boil things down to pretty easy things. Firstly, expand your sources. You don't own the smartest people. Think about competitions. Think about getting involved with academic institutions. Thinking about asking your customers. You know, maybe your customers know about what they want more than you do. You've got to actually cast the widest possible net. And innovation starts from the top. It is a cultural thing. You have to actually make change the norm. Because people like stability. Most people love coming into work, knowing what they're going to be doing, earn the money, do their work, go home, and play with the kids in the evening. But that's not the comfortable world we're moving into. We're moving into a world where change is going to be normal. The companies that are successful are those that change on a day-by-day basis, where people are inspired to change, where people are motivated to change. In fact, they realize that their rule is to go in there and change things on a day-by-day basis, to move forwards. You are not ever in the future going to have the time to actually catch your breath and say, well, that's good, we've done all that transformation, now we can sit back and enjoy the fruits. Because for every transformation, there is another transformation beyond that. You know, every mountain you climb, there's another higher mountain beyond that hilltop. And it's going to be the same. And the distance between them, the time that you have between one and the next, is not long. We're already starting to look beyond digital business. You know, everyone's working at the moment on the transformation inside digital business. And the move from the old analog styles of doing things towards the digital styles of things. And transformation and innovation. Well, I can tell you, as soon as you've actually done that transformation, you're going to face the next stage. Because there's companies out there that are already moving beyond digital business. Transformation, innovation, and change are going to be the norm. And finally, not everything will work. When something fails, think about it from a scientific point of view. You now know that doesn't work. Fine. You've learned something. Now, that doesn't mean it won't work in the future, but at this point in time, with the resources you have and the way things are going and the technology available, it doesn't work. So now let's not agonize about that. Let's not try and actually make it work and spend more and more resources and keep going. Just forget it. Move on one side, understand why it didn't work, and move on. And that is probably the hardest lesson to actually inculcate into organizations. Because organizations and individuals who work for them have gotten used to this idea that they must succeed. Well, failure is a form of success. It's as simple as that. Failure simply shows you that that particular thing didn't work, and therefore it's time to try something else. So as a final warning, you know, if you keep doing what you're doing now, then you almost certainly will not be doing it in 2020. Some other organization will be doing something that has made what you're doing today irrelevant, or they'll be doing it in a different way. You know, final piece of advice, probably don't focus too much on innovation as far as the technology is concerned. The focus doesn't want to be on technology innovation. Everyone's got access to that. The biggest challenge facing large organizations is the business model innovation. You know, ask yourself the rhetorical question of, if Uber was going to come into my industry, how would it play it? You know, don't get Ubered, Uber the competition. Thanks very much.
Prentice. Thank you very much.